This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Joe Lonsdale, who is a managing partner at 8VC and also serves on the Board of Trustees of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. They discuss the fallout from the first presidential debate of 2024, the future of conservatism and the Republican Party, and his optimistic view of America's future.
Joe Lonsdale, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Roger. Good to be on.
Well, you're known throughout, obviously, as one of the founders of the Palantir, your world in VC, leading it with your company, 8VC. Less well known, perhaps, is in 2008, you started with your wife, Taylor, the Cicero Institute. And of course, we've gotten to a chance to work together and get to know you because you're a trustee for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute. So much to chat with you about, but I'll start with one of the more prescient things you wrote of late. This was on June 27th, the day of the presidential debate, the now infamous presidential debate. And you said what everybody should have said in retrospect, which is Mr. Biden and the political left, is what you wrote, now face a tough run in November, that Mr. Biden lacks the strength to campaign as vigorously as he once did. And strength and vigor were two things that did not show up for President Biden. You obviously were not surprised, or perhaps, Joe, did it go even worse than you anticipated?
You know, there's been a lot of rumors about what's going on around this, the current president and the administration, Roger. It's obviously, it's obviously these people are not very honest about what's going on. I think it's very good to see that. I think they're not very honest about a lot of things, and this is just one of them. But, beyond the personal attacks, I think the point of the piece in The Economist that I wrote that day was just that, the administration overall is going the wrong direction for our country. Basically, we have something where it's just incompetent, right? Like we have billions of dollars that are supposed to be spent on, and you forget what you think about industrial policy. We could debate industrial policy, but if you're going to do a CHIPS Act, you're going to spend all this money building these plants. And I think I mentioned, right now we're short of female construction workers because there's like 19 DEI rules. That's just one of them, is stopping that. And it'd be one thing if it was just this one-off thing where we weren't building these things, but everything else they're trying to build is also delayed by years because of these crazy rules, crazy red tape, crazy DEI stuff. Just general incompetence, right? They haven't built enough electric chargers. They won't work with Elon because he doesn't agree with them on things. Therefore, they can't use, Starlink to do FAA stuff they'd agreed to connect people with money. It's just which direction is the country going to go? And, coming back to Reagan, it really is another time for choosing in our country. Which direction are we going to go, the next couple decades?
And you've been very public that because of some of the reasons you've just articulated, that it made sense from a business standpoint, from where the U.S. economy needs to go, that President Trump is a candidate who you'll support. And you rightly point out that it's a unique moment in American political history. You've written this, that we have the opportunity to select a candidate based on a record each has had serving in the White House.
I respect that some people disagree. I respect that people are very focused on particulars of personality. And maybe a lot of people don't love Biden and don't necessarily admire his family, but they just can't stand Trump. And I understand people I respect have different views on this, but to me it's very clear one side's appointing mostly originalist jurists, one side's trying to limit and check government power, and one side is very clearly appointing activists and weaponizing government power. And so it's not just for business; it's also for, frankly, like the ethics of our country. And where our country is going, and the choice: are we going towards a regime that has people who want censorship and who are giving money to help censor things, or are we going towards a regime that is more in line with the values of the Constitution? It's very clear to me that the right overall right now is much more in line with liberty and the Constitution. So I think that's what we have to support.
Well, all for supporting the Constitution and liberty. I do want to get your take on currents within the conservative movement and the Republican Party, and then we'll get to some of the other specific policy issues. But there is an emerging arm within the conservative movement, so-called statist conservatives. That's the way I think of it. Some refer to it as common good conservatives. But what they stand for is something, I think, quite different, certainly what President Reagan pushed in office and prior office, where they view government. They view the federal government as a place that really should be the answer for many of individual needs. In other words, that whereas for generations, conservatives thought that, hey, we should have limited government. May have heard you just say that a moment ago. Now, these conservatives think that we should be looking to federal government to provide more of our social welfare needs. And a related story, Joe, this is you get a bipartisan ovation during a State of Union by President Biden, where he said we're not going to touch entitlements, right? Both Democrats and Republicans applaud that. That is decidedly not where you are. And, the techno-optimist community, which you're a leading voice of, I don't know if you kind of put yourself in that group, but that's, I think, how you're viewed, really believe that the private sector outside of government is a place where our economy and our society should thrive. Give me your take on those currents within the conservative movement.
Yeah, listen, Roger, there's a lot of anger on the right about a lot of very unfair things, I think, that have happened, and there's a lot of ways in which government has tilted the playing field against a lot of people in our country, right? And so I think starting from that perspective, and then frankly, there's a lot of ways the Fortune 500 has been embracing a lot of woke nonsense, right? A lot of these people who run Fortune 500 companies, they don't get there based on creating it themselves. It's not always based on merit. There's a lot of politics as well in these big companies. These companies have moats they use the government to enforce, and so you get a lot of kind of like ridiculous stuff coming out of these places, and it frustrates a lot of people on the right. They see themselves falling behind, and they see these corporations are not on their side necessarily, and so they want to take action, and they're willing to use the government. They're willing to vote to use it in ways they see are helpful for them, and so I think we have to acknowledge where they're coming from and why they're coming from that perspective, and it makes a lot of sense. I think the leaders on the right, our job is how can we serve these people in terms of having the best results in their lives, in their children's and their grandchildren's lives, in a way that's sustainable, in a way that's true to what makes our country work. And I think it's our job to frankly, A, help them, but B, also teach them, here's what is going to be the best thing for our country, to let you thrive and let your children thrive. And if we do start embracing this kind of statism, here's how it's going to break things, and here's how it's going to be captured even more by the left, and here's how it's going to be captured by others. And here's, I think it's very clear, to people who really study these things, like when you founded the United States of America, and in every generation since, liberty is on the side of the little guy. Liberty is on the side of the people who don't have the ability to capture the government. Liberty is on the side of the businesses that don't have the ability to capture the government, right? I think, there's like the small tech versus big tech framework that we give out. Like if you're doing new things, if you're running a small business, if you're creating something new, then the statism and the top-down planning is going to crush you because it's going to be captured by people against you. So I think there are ideologues on the right that are taking advantage of this and trying to maybe go along with a more statist playbook because they think they can score them points with some people who are rightly frustrated on the populist side, but it's definitely not a good direction for our country. And I think it's our job on the right to fight for these people. And sometimes the right is not fighting hard enough, and it's not fighting for these people. So it needs to do that, but it needs to do that in ways that are true to our principles and true to what's going to make the country work.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's just been somewhat surprising that their response to the problem, and it seems like you have a common in articulation of what the problem is, right? That the solution that they're offering redounds to the federal government. And don't see evidence that outside of a few areas, both from a constitution and in terms of record, that the federal government is the most efficient or effective way.
The federal government is viciously incompetent. It's more incompetent now than it's ever been, Roger. A lot of people say, why can't it do these amazing things that it did in the 1950s and 60s? And you say, listen, in the 1950s and 60s was a unique time in our history where it's just after a total war, World War II. Everyone competent was involved with the government. You had a world where innovation was very expensive, and so you had to be part of a big institution if you were a great engineer, a great scientist, in order to push things forward. And so you had this kind of concentration of merit, and you had a world where the government was still very focused on merit with these people. 2 generations later, everyone competent could do things independently. The merit has gone down and down and down and down. Ever since like the late 80s, early 90s, we have court cases to say you can't hold people accountable. You can't even test them anymore in the government. We have millions of government workers, Roger. We can't even test them in any which way because guess what? Every possible type of test you do is going to have disparate impact. There's going to be some people of different races. The Asians are going to outperform the whites. The whites are going to outperform the blacks on average on certain tests. Therefore, we can't have any merit tests at all. And for some reason, we've gone along with this now for 30 years. Of course, our government's totally inept. So do I think we should try and make the government more competent, by the way? Yeah, I think we should. I think we should make it smaller and more competent, both things we should be doing. But should we be trying as people anyone in our country, giving the government more power to solve problems, that is like the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Well, and you've certainly been one of the leading advocates for meritocracy and calling out when we have institutions, be it government or elsewhere, that have abandoned that. I was in a conversation with a former elected official, senior conservative, no longer in office, but held it at a high level prior to. And he challenged me. He said, well, who is the leading advocate, the leading elected official on the conservative side who espouses the point of view, Joe, that you just shared? I started with Mitch McConnell, and he's a leading advocate, but he's not a young man. You look at leading conservatives, are they out there going to those core foundational principles that you've articulated and fighting for them on the floor of the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress? Most of the younger element, or many in the younger element that are out there certainly making a lot of noise, seem to be taking the status conservative point of view. Am I missing someone? Is someone you'd point to, Joe?
Well, I mean, I think Rand Paul is generally very good. I think Thomas Massey, I don't agree with him on everything, but he has some very strong kind of pro-liberty views. I think we have a lot of governors in our country who generally are very much on the pro-liberty side. I think our governor here in Texas, Governor Abbott, Governor DeSantis in Florida, you have, I mean, he's not always in line with this, but I think probably 19 out of 20 times he's on the side of the liberty side and on the side of smaller government. And you got a lot of other ones too. Governor state in Oklahoma, there's a list of
governors,
15 of them,
Yeah, it makes sense that you're pushing governors, and certainly the institution in which you sit on the board and I work. These ideas came from someone who served as governor prior to becoming president. I'd also probably add Governor Youngkin on that, somebody who
I think Governor Youngkin's a very competent guy. I think he's very strong principles. Listen, when you run for office these days, especially it seems like at a national level, there's a lot of strains of populism in our society, and I think people who run for office are very often kind of repeating back what they're hearing and what they think is going to get them elected. And it's you do have a few strong people in Congress, but I think there's also just this temptation to have to reflect back at society what they're hearing. And so I think you get these populist strains, come into things, especially like primaries work, unfortunately, right now, is you have to basically speak to the types of things that the primary voters want to hear. And you get some very populist, very extreme primary voters in our country on both sides.
Well, I think that's right. I'm glad we were talking about governors because it's a good segue, Joe, to the Cicero Institute, which I'd love for you to share with our viewers and listeners what that is. And one of the features of it, which I like and admire and drawn to, is it's pushing public policy, not at the federal level, as we were just discussing, but actually kind of what our founders intended, particularly as it relates to domestic policy at the state level. Could you share more about Cicero, and then we'll talk about some of the very significant developments that relate to some of their priorities?
Yeah, I think that's right. States were intended by the founders of America to be the laboratories of democracy. And they were frankly supposed to be where most of the government resided. Like the federal government's supposed to be a lot smaller, and you're supposed to test and try experiments and learn from them and iterate at the state level. And it's almost impossible, Roger, if you have a great idea how something should work, to get it done federally these days. It could take years. I'll give you an example. There's about $40 billion we spend on training programs at a federal level. It's like a hodgepodge of things we've passed over the last 30 years. And as someone on the very liberty-oriented side, I'm skeptical government should be doing this at all. But you know what? If it's going to do it, let's at least do it competently with good results, right? And so what we oftentimes do at Cicero is we say, what's the right accountability here? What's the right way to put incentives in place? And what we've seen, because there's a lot of states that do these too in different ways, is we've seen that if you tie the budget of the program to its results, that and it has to be results you can't game, right? If you tie budget or program to something for technical vocational schools at graduation rate from those schools, they'll just graduate everyone, but it'll still be useless, right? Who knows? God knows what they'll have taught them, right? Especially these days. But if you actually tie it to the salaries, for example, coming out of the training program for the next 3 years, like what does this do for your career? Then the people running it have to think, wow, what skills do I teach? What businesses do I partner with? And what we've seen with a lot of these things at a state level is you go in and you literally tie the full budget, to the average salary coming out over 3 years, and you reallocate amongst different training programs, different vocational schools. You basically double the effectiveness. You double the salaries coming out of these places when it's fully accountable. And of course,
mind-boggling stuff. Budgets tied to results.
A budget's tied to results. I think it's the same way that our free society works bottom up. If government's going to do something, make it reflect our free society. Make it be competent. And you know what? This isn't a left versus right idea. This is a freedom versus totalitarian idea. This is a U.S. versus Soviet idea. Why are we doing things in a Soviet way. And so if you want to get this stuff right, it's very hard to get that done at a federal level right now. But the idea is let's go to states, let's go to Texas, let's go to Florida, let's go to Tennessee, let's go to great states that have a strong governor, strong legislature. They want to be bold, and let's create bold policy, and let's teach our country, here's what bold policy can achieve to lift up the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And then when it works, as it has, let's bring it to other states. Let's bring it to DC if we ever do get in charge. But and what happens is a lot of people are very, very busy in office. If you are a legislature in the state, if you're in a governor's administration, there's like a million things in your mind, especially if you're legislature, you don't really have good staff. So we could do the research for you. We can come, we could partner with you. We can actually get these things done. So we're getting dozens of laws passed each year now with teams in 20 states, and it's working really well.
There's another element to it, and congrats on the success. But our Constitution still bounds, still limits, despite the regulatory state's best efforts, the power of the federal government, and so much power resides within the states should the states seek to leverage it. And so my sense is, you were mentioning before, part of it is it's so hard to get things done at the federal level, but if you're looking to impact lives of everyday Americans, you can do a lot within the states because that really is the domain for state level government and not the federal government. I mean, is that still true in your judgment?
Unfortunately, it was surprising to me, Roger, doing this because there are so few groups just trying to come and fix things, right? So when you meet someone who's in the Senate of a state, or you meet someone who's in the in the governor's office, they're like, well, how can we help you with your business? How are you trying to make money? And like, no, I'm not here to make any money. I already have enough money for my kids and my grandkids. If our country fails, that's what's going to screw over my family. So my incentive is very much aligned. Like, let's keep things functional here. And it's unfortunate they're not used to that. They're not used to someone coming. And it's very funny when the far left, by the way, the far left hates these things we do because the far left is part of the government union. They don't want incentives. They don't want accountability, right? They don't want anyone tracking their spend because their spend goes to these NGOs, which helps get out the vote for the far left, right? They use tons of government money inappropriately, and any kind of accountability is against them. And so they're trying to attack me. And remember, we're trying to focus on money going to these nonprofits, these NGOs, like in Arizona, and you get all these headlines from them. They're writing, Joe Lonsdale trying to profit from homelessness in Arizona. And I'm like, I have no idea how I'm going to make money on this. I'm literally just trying to make the spending accountable. That's all I care about. And they have no idea how to attack you even because they're so used to just attacking you for trying to make money. It has nothing to do with making money. This is having to do with like making our country functional and making it work.
You mentioned homelessness, Joe. And again, we're with Joe Lonsdale. He is the founder, along with his wife, of the Cicero Institute, one of the founders of Palantir Technologies, and also venture capitalist with leading and founding 8VC. We were talking about homelessness just a moment ago, and here's actually one where the federal government did get in the way of allowing the states and local governments to do what they wanted to do when it came to dealing with homelessness. And it was a major decision of the Supreme Court this session. And it dealt with the so-called Chevron
It was the Grants Pass case. I mean, we wrote Cicero actually submitted a briefing.
So I wanted you, if you could, tell us about Chevron, because it's sort of the thing that only regulatory lawyers in Washington, D.C. kind of were aware of, but it had a huge outsized impact on a variety of things, including homelessness. And tell us about Cicero's involvement in that decision.
So there's two different cases here that came up in the last couple of weeks. The first one, Grants Pass, was actually allowing cities to ban people from camping in the city, basically, which you obviously need to do if you're going to enforce law. It's actually able to take them and say, listen, if you're camping, actually we're going to require you to get services instead, because you have these drug addicts just like basically dying on the streets, and you have sex trafficking, drug trafficking breaking our cities, and you have all these groups. Roger, by the way, this is an important fact: the federal government at HUD funds huge amounts of money to nonprofits. There's thousands of NGOs getting money, and these groups are basically very corrupt because A, they get more money if there's more messes in the cities, and B, they're using their employees are regularly getting free houses that are being paid for, as well as regularly running get out the vote efforts for the left, and C, like the thing they're doing in all of our cities, this is important to understand, is that they're giving out free houses, right? They're giving out it's like all this money, and they're giving it to people who are on drugs, who are committing crimes. They literally have a scoring index where you get more points to get free house if you're on drugs, if you're not recovering from drugs, if you're committing crimes, if you're committing violent crimes. So you have these people just breaking our country. And then when we try to push back and try to put other rules in place, they literally get activists on the local courts and try to stop you. So it's great to have the Supreme Court push back and say, guess what? You are allowed to hold people accountable. You are allowed to force service.
And just the mechanism through which they were able to push back is that they said it was outside the domain of whether it was a local or state a law that was passed, that somehow they were able to fend it off on the basis of the Supreme Court.
And so we were able to, and so the Supreme Court came in and said, you are allowed to enforce these things. And by the way, as much as I don't always get along with Gavin Newsom, even he at this point said this is crazy. He was on the side of like the moderates, which, as were a lot of other leaders in California, because you have to be able to clean things up. Otherwise, it's a total mess. This is how crazy the far left is. It's terrifying. People like Sotomayor would tell you, in the Supreme Court, you can't do this. So that's one. But then the bigger one in the last couple of weeks, like you said, Chevron. Chevron's something that, I've been looking forward to this decision for over 2 decades since I started studying, abuse of power in government. And if you go back and look at like some of the biggest abuses of power in our civilization, it really happened obviously all the time in the past. But in England in the 17th century, you had the Star Chamber with King Charles I. This was the king, remember, eventually chopped off his head and had the whole early revolution. But basically, you basically had these like regulatory bodies that were just going around making all sorts of crazy rulings, totally unchecked. If you stood up and you complained about the king, if you did anything against the interests of his friends, who knows, maybe you had a pretty wife and something that one of his guys wanted, like this is going to rule against you, it's going to take you out. And so having gone through this kind of like deprivations and like terrible things with the unchecked power of a monarch, obviously that you limited that a little bit in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution, but you still had a lot of it going on. So our founders had this in their history, had this on their mind. Like, we don't want unchecked government. Every single part of our government is going to check the other part. It's going to be small. It's going to not be able to do this. And, fast forward to the early 20th century, with the progressive movement, which, I agree with a lot of things Teddy Roosevelt was doing in the progressive movement, but frankly, it went way too far. It got to the point with Woodrow Wilson where they believed the government could like run everything top down with these regulators. And so you basically put back in the star chambers, you put back in these experts, and then over time, they fought harder and harder to make sure they're unchecked. There's no way to check them. We call them the fourth branch of government, right? We have the president, we have Congress, and we have the courts, and these regulators obviously are part of the executive branch. Like, the executive should be able to check them, and the courts should be able to check them as well. And the left has fought for them to be independent of the executive. They don't want. There's a big fight going on right now. Trump would put loyalists into these places. Right. Trump's in charge of these things if he's president, right? Like, whoever's president is supposed to be in charge. So first of all, you need to have people be able in charge of them. And second, if they do something arbitrary, you need to be able to say, no, that's not the law. Congress didn't say you could do this to me. I'm going to challenge you.
And Joe, that was always my kind of the part of Chevron that was could have been addressed by the Congress, right? I mean, and it's good the court has stepped in. I agree with you, but in some respects, this was a problem that Congress made by effectively outsourcing the interpretation of the laws, or just the application to the executive
that's partially
branch.
True. That's partially true, Roger. So Congress has many cases where they should have been more specific about things, but there's many, many other cases, literally tens of thousands of them, where the regulators just created something because it was convenient to them. And it was clearly outside the bounds of what Congress intended, and you had no means of appeal, because you could normally, you'd say, in the actual case that ended Chevron deference, you probably saw, you literally have these fishermen. Many of these fishermen are lower middle class fishermen. Maybe some were doing well, and you had inspectors, and the agency just decided out of nowhere, they pulled it out of their behinds, that the fishermen had to pay for the government people to go on their boats. So literally, you're paying a salary to a government inspector. Like, it's annoying enough that you have a government inspector on my boat watching me. That sounds pretty terrible.
I got to pay you to be there.
You make me pay him to be on there? That's insane.
So what do you think?
If this was a law, that'd be one thing. This is just them making it up, right? So they constantly just make things up. They constantly bully you. If you stand up to them, they investigate you and make your life miserable, and you have no check on their power. So the whole point of America is, guess what? That was how England worked under the king. That's not how a free society works. You need to have a check on their power, and the courts putting that back in is common sense.
Yeah, and it's arbitrary and capricious. One of those things when you see it. That example certainly captures it. And then you add to that if you sought to appeal an administrative decision, you're often boxed into that same agency, and you didn't even get to an article.
Yeah, the
through
agency
court.
have their own courts, the administrative law courts. So you appeal to them. So they're basically judge, jury, executioner, and they really do act like the mafia, Roger. A lot of them, they're like basically, if you give us any trouble, if you speak out against us, we're gonna come and we're gonna find ways to investigate you and your companies and make your life miserable. Like you better
Which is
shut up and you better go
hugely
along.
undermining separation of powers. Joe, you mentioned before that you did study this. Where did you go to school to study this stuff? This is perhaps part of the civics and Western history that too many American students are not getting. Who is your mentor?
Too many
Who taught you
American
this?
students are not getting this at all. You know, we're starting a new university here in Austin, University of Austin, and we're at our first class just starting. And we want to make sure we teach them these things and these great debates. You know, I studied computer science at Stanford, but I was lucky to have Milton Friedman as a mentor at the time there, who was at Hoover back then, and I got to have a lot of different meals and conversations with him and a lot of his peers. His wife Rose was around back then. All sorts of really great people. And frankly, I have to give credit to my father and my brother, who both kind of gave me a lot of different books to read when we were younger. And my brother's really into economics and whatnot too. So I think having this history is something you don't get in school very often, but you do get it from mentors. And we do need a few more universities teaching this stuff again, Roger.
Best of luck to you on University of Austin. And I think you mentioned that the first class it will be come together this fall. Is that correct? I hear that?
That's right. That's right. We got about at least 90 students so far. We keep keeping it small, really high end. A lot of these kids turned down Harvard, Stanford, Yale. So very high quality class. Amazing professors. We had thousands of professors apply when we announced it, and we're going to build a competitor to Harvard and Stanford.
Professor Lonsdale, are you going to teach a seminar?
My two co-founders are Neil Ferguson, who's a really great historian and thinker, and he's going to be teaching, and Barry Weiss, who I think she has the fastest growing media company in the U.S., and she's going to be teaching a class as well. But I'm definitely contributing to STEM and to other things going on there.
Well, funny you should mention Neil Ferguson, because I did want to take up something he wrote recently about the state of America today. The title in the Free Press you just mentioned, founded by Barry Weiss, which of course is growing wild success. This was Neil Ferguson's first piece for the Free Press. I believe he was writing something regularly for Bloomberg prior to. The title is "We Are All Soviets Now." It made me sad, Joe, because Neil Ferguson, great historian, financial historian, but always seemed to want to bet on America, and kind of got to the point where he seems to have come to the conclusion he's seen enough, and now perhaps not even adopting a declinist mindset. This is what he said. I'd love to get your reaction to it. Again, an admirer, but perhaps not an admirer of this piece. He said, "A government with a permanent deficit and a bloated military, a bogus ideology pushed by elites, poor health among ordinary people." Sound familiar? And then he goes and makes the case. To me, I think he undervalued our military. We don't have to talk about that piece, although I know you're expert and have thoughts there, but also undervalued the work that you do and the innovation that we see in this country. A friend of mine, Jordan Hirsch, wrote a letter that was published today challenging the thrust of his argument on these grounds. I think you just look at the leading tech companies in the world. I think 7 out of 10 are American. Isn't that enough to discount what Neil Ferguson's written?
I don't know if that's enough to discount it, because those 7 big tech companies have pretty much been taken over by authoritarians, Roger. So that's not necessarily the thing you want to say.
The metric.
I love America. I am betting on America. I've built more billion-dollar companies in this country than anyone else in my generation, and my sixth company has crossed $1 billion valuation. Just did that, so I'm obviously biased. Like I'm sitting over here.
Did you say 6, Joe? I wasn't aware of that. Okay.
Yeah, there's 6 of them now that are worth $1 billion. That's
well, I think we have to challenge you. You need to get to trillion now, okay? Because it's getting boring with billions.
My friend Elon is definitely outperforming me, and I think he'll make it there first. But he's also here in Austin, Texas. No, I'm doing my best. We're scaling these things. I'm still only 41 years old, so I got another decade. Roger. Obviously, I'm building stuff here. I have the best people in the world coming and working with me. We're pushing things forward that are gonna probably let people live a lot longer. We have, the new stuff we're doing actually is ahead of the rest of the world. But that's what makes America great, is the fact that we have the new stuff we could do. It's not the old existing stuff. If it was just Boeing we're relying on, Boeing's embarrassing right now. They basically they comp their executives on things like DEI, and they turned away from merit. and they broke a lot of stuff and they screwed up, and they didn't have the substantive people in charge. And that's true of a lot of our government. It's true of a lot of our universities. So Neil is right to try to shock people. We need to realize that there are a lot of things that are broken in this country that we've been putting up with, and this generation in charge is it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. So he is 100% right about that. If we just do status quo, if we don't build new things, we're in trouble. But I'm building a new university. I'm building new defense companies with my friends that are running circles around the old ones right now. We are building a lot of new things that are raising productivity in AI. So the innovation world is by far the brightest spot in our country. And if we can make our government smaller and more competent and less corrupt, then yes, I think we're going to be in a great spot. But I think Neil's right. If you just leave things on autopilot and you don't build anew, and you don't fight, and you don't get that fighting spirit back into our civilization, we're facing some real challenges here.
Take that point, but is there any other country in the world, Joe, that you could have done what you've done through age 41?
There's no other country in the world that I could have done what I've done, and I'm an American optimist. That's the name of my podcast at the end of the day, and I do believe this is going to be the greatest country in the world 20 years from now as well, but it's not going to be that unless we fight for it, unless we fight like hell for it. We got to teach people about the principles of the civilization. We got to teach people about why communism is terrible and why it failed. And there's a lot of work we have to do because people are trying to apply these ideas again, and they're really going to break things if we don't overcome that and we don't put merit and freedom back in place.
Well, I think we need to get Neil on your podcast again and give him that dose of optimism. I'll leave it to you to persuade him. You just hit on something which I want to discuss prior to closing out this conversation. Again, thank you for being on. It's always great to chat with you. You have partnered or partnering with the Reagan Foundation Institute, rolling it out, an anti-communist high school program. And I heard you discuss this kind of early on, laying out the idea. Share a little bit about it, and it really captures competing for the minds and using education to get at stuff that otherwise may not be taught.
You know, this is something we've really dropped the ball on as a country, Roger. Thomas Jefferson, one of our founders and early presidents, he thought the main point of public education was to teach the common man about the danger of despotism, basically about the importance of liberty. And so he said, there's only one thing you can accomplish in public education, that would be it. And it's ironic because if there's only one thing public education is accomplishing right now, it's the opposite of that. It's spreading authoritarian nonsense. It's spreading people wanting things to work more top down and wanting to demonize liberty and demonize innovation and profit and all these sorts of things. And so we need to turn public education back to the liberty side. And what you see is that most people don't realize that so many bad ideas they're hearing today, so many bad ideas in the far left, actually were tried in the 20th century.
Right.
Like you literally, just to walk through a basic thing, I think people don't realize, we did kill all the landlords in China. They killed the landlords in China. 2 million of them died. And then they shared the land more equally, but then everyone who was doing well was still doing better because it was unfair, because certain people obviously knew how to work harder, knew how to do things better. So it wasn't equitable. So what did they do, Roger? They decided they're going to share all of the results. All of the land had to be owned equally, in the sense that everything coming out has to be shared equally. And then guess what happened? You had like 50 million people die in a famine, because when you make everyone share everything equally, it's not human nature. It doesn't work. This idea of equity killed a ton of people. It wasn't just there. People died all over the world, just in horrible ways. And you try to do these experiments, they don't work. The authoritarians try to keep things under control because we have a top-down society, and you end up killing a ton of people, and you end up breaking things and making everyone poor. So I mean, we've run this experiment like dozens of times now, and like most kids are just totally unaware of this. They're totally unaware that the equity idea that they're hearing pitched to them from the far left, that these ideas of profit being evil, of like needing to constrain growth, like all these things. All
Political
these
liberty,
ideas.
economic liberty, religious liberty. We've seen. I mean, you have people from the captive nations that can still testify to this. They know what it's like to be on the other side.
Yeah, but it is not exactly. So we're having people come whose families' lives were ruined, people whose friends' lives were ruined, who saw this happen to their country, and it's not enough. It's not enough in education just to teach about the fact that people died, just to teach about the fact that there were bad ideas. You have to tie it to today. There are terrible ideas today that are tied to this. So the goal for the Reagan Foundation, the Reagan Presidential Library, is we're going to have over 1 million young students in K to 12, probably more like junior high and high school, who actually not only learn about all these deaths and all these horrible ideas, but they're all going to learn about how it's tied to a lot of cancel culture and a lot of like extremely dangerous quote unquote woke ideas today that are basically tied to things that kill people. And they have to know that, because if they're going to want to apply, and listen, there's a lot of positive things about some progressive values. I'm not saying all those values are negative. There's a lot of kind of heart, and there's a lot of wanting people to do well. And there's a lot of like places that there's good that comes from. So if they want to apply that heart, and they want to apply those good ideas, they need to apply that within a framework that doesn't repeat these horrible mistakes of the past that demonize success and that break society.
I'm very bullish on this program, Joe, and in part because I've seen something similar apply to teaching young people about the Holocaust. When you have survivors come into classrooms and they talk about not just about the devastation and the genocide that was the Holocaust, but also about the ideology and the ideas that animated it.
The idea, I think the important thing there that's equivalent, Roger, there's a great article in the Free Press on this week, is it's not just understanding who died at Auschwitz and how horrible it was, but it's that the idea that society loves to blame Jews for what's going wrong, right? So you have people in society today blaming Jews on one hand for being like really wealthy and controlling everything and being like really good capitalists that are too good. And then you have them on the other hand blaming Jews for like socialism and Marxism and all these like horrible ideas. And it's very funny, like whatever's going wrong on each side, the far left, the far right, it's like very easy that they blame the Jews. It's kind of a natural thing. And you have to realize like that's what's tied to the Holocaust, not just the actual deaths, right? So you kind of have to see what today is happening and how is that related. And it's very sad because there are a lot of things happening today that are very similar to me to the 1930s.
I completely agree that anti-Semitism is just a great example of how that's playing out in the U.S. today. And to me, it's only reinforced the importance of this kind of education, the kind you just described. You referenced that piece in the Free Press, that we need to do more of, because in the absence of it, you see what happens. Just assuming that it'll never again, that everybody would look at the Holocaust and say, okay, of course, that can't happen again.
Well, we need the education for sure that ties it to this that's going on, and frankly, we need a lot of guns. So this time they try to take away our guns. I'm not making the mistake that my relatives made in Poland. So they're not getting them. I'll tell you that.
Joe Lonsdale, we're going to go to our lightning round, and here we'll ask you to share your favorite Reagan speech, quote, book. You can give us all three, two, or just one. What do you got?
I think Sperry's speech was A Time for Choosing. It was about, it was really interesting if you go back and look at this in the 60s. This is kind of the speech that vaulted him into real political fame. And it's talking about peace. He was talking about inflation, the deficit. He was talking about vote harvesting at the time by trying to pay people off with parts of the Great Society program, the same way the Biden administration, today is paying people off with the student debt stuff. But really, ultimately, he was talking about the choice between freedom versus totalitarianism. And so I think this is a very important speech.
Yeah, and the thing I love about that speech, just in our last minute, is, President Reagan was a very elevating figure. He was somebody who didn't get in and use ad hominem, taking on his adversaries. It was often about ideas, kind of like what our conversation's been about, not about individuals. But if there was one adversary that he took on besides communism and communists, it was bureaucracy. And he felt that was one of the greatest threats to American society and to liberty in America.
I think he did a great job in some ways. Unfortunately, that was not a victory he won thoroughly enough. We have that battle even more so to fight today, and this is my obsession, of course, with the Sister Institute. You make things accountable. You defund things that are broken, and we have to fight that harder right now.
No doubt, the work goes on. Joe Lonsdale, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Roger.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.